Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and an honor to have been invited to the ranking as graduate lecture. And I want to thank you, all of you, for coming here. So the title of my presentation, of my lecture, is The Mediterranean Diet as the Gold Standard for Cardiovascular Health. First of all, I would let me to thank all my collaborators in the departments of nutrition and epidemiology and preventive medicine and the primary healthcare system of Navarra. Most of what I am going to present here is due to their enthusiastic and committed work. So this is the outline that I'm going to follow. I'm going to speak a little bit about non-communicable disease, cardiovascular disease, then dietary patterns, the observational studies that we have on the Mediterranean diet and cardiovascular health, now the problem of association or causality, and then I will present, this is what will take more time, the Predimed trial, and now a new study, a new trial that we are developing now that is called Predimed Plus. So let's start with the first topic. Non-communicable diseases, as you know, are the main priority now for public health. And among non-communicable disease, as you all know very well, cardiovascular disease is the first cause of death in the world, with 17 million deaths every year. But the projections, due to the aging of the population, is that we are going to reach 23 million deaths a year in 2030. You can compare cardiovascular disease with other major chronic diseases. But what you perhaps do not have in your minds now is the problem of morbidity, not also mortality and premature morbidity. When we look at disability-adjusted life years, now in the ranking, the first place is ischemic heart disease and the third place is stroke. So they are not only causes of death, but of premature death and disability. So we could say that 3 of every 5 deaths are due to cardiovascular disease or cancer or lung disease or diabetes. These 4 causes are responsible for 3 out of every 5 deaths in the world. So we can say, who is going to get one of these diseases? Is this a kind of Russian roulette? So we know that this is not at random. We know that especially cardiovascular disease is highly predictable. We have these 7 cardiovascular health metrics. This is a follow-up of 15 years of cohort studies with cardiovascular disease mortality as the end point. And for those who have 6 or 7 out of the 7 health metrics, the reduction in mortality is 76%. So you see that they have to collapse 0 to 1 and 6 to 7 because there are very few people in those extremes. Do you know what are the 7 health metrics? Perhaps you have all of them in mind. But this is the goal for the American Heart Association for 2020, to meet these 7 health metrics. This is very good news for me because now they are looking at health instead of looking at disease. We are not speaking of risk factors anymore. We are speaking of health metrics. So we know how to prevent cardiovascular disease, but this is our problem. A clever person solves a problem, a wise person avoids it. Why do not we avoid cardiovascular disease when we know perfectly how to avoid it? We have these 7 health metrics. So let's think of them. This is in blank, just trying to make your brains work more rapidly at this early hour of the morning. So you're thinking in avoiding smoking, you're thinking in physical activity, you're thinking in blood cholesterol. What else are you thinking? Low BMI, healthy diet. So these are the 7 health metrics. The apparently bad news is that only 1.1% of the American population meet the 7 health metrics. The good news is that we have a large room for improvement, if we are optimistic. So let's think for a moment. Has BMI something to do with eating? Has healthy eating something to do with eating? And what about total cholesterol? And what about blood pressure? And what about blood glucose? 5 of them are directly related to eating habits. And even in a wider sense, if we think in the balance between input and output of calories, physical activity is also, in a wide sense, in a broad sense, related to eating habits. So we have that 6 out of these 7 health metrics are directly or indirectly related to food habits. So we need to look at the food habits of people in order to anticipate the problem. A wise man avoids the problem. So let's look at dietary patterns. Here we have a very early study, the 7 countries study. Ansel Keys, who died in 2004 when he was 100, and he was in very good shape in the years previous to his death. The same year, the founder of McDonald's died with 60 years of a myocardial infarction. We can say nothing with 2 observations in epidemiology, but you know. So Ansel Keys developed he was the one who proposed the diet heart hypothesis with the Mediterranean diet. The guy who coined the term Mediterranean diet was Ansel Keys. And he observed in 7 countries, I am just writing here a very brief summary of 3 of these countries, a sharp contrast in the rates of cardiovascular death, especially coronary heart disease, and also dramatic differences in food habits. So in Greece, in Crete, he found a high intake of fat, but mainly from olive oil, a plant-based diet, and a very low coronary mortality. Without any use of butter for cooking, olive oil, you see the dramatic contrast. And especially he found a strong inverse dose-response relationship between the monosaturated to saturated fat ratio and coronary heart disease death rate. So he thought that monosaturated coming from olive oil was protective, saturated was detrimental. But this is very weak from an epidemiologic point of view to infer causality, because it is an ecological design. So Ansel Keys defined in this literary way, artistic way, the Mediterranean diet. He said that the Mediterranean diet is mainly a plant-based diet with pasta, leaves, literally swimming in olive oil, a lot of salads, all kinds of vegetables in season, a little bit of cheese or yogurt. The dessert is always fruit, not cakes, not pies, not sugary desserts, and frequently washed down with red wine. This is a romantic definition of the Mediterranean diet, in my view. It is not an operational definition of the Mediterranean diet. But this is a first step. So now, 1 year ago, the Scientific Advisory Board for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans proposed dietary patterns. And this is a very nice scientific report. For me, this is the best thing that has been ever done in reviewing the evidence in nutrition. It is 571 pages full of science about nutrition. It is a very good report. And they say that dietary patterns are defined as the quantities, proportion, variety, or combination of different foods and beverages in diets and the frequency with which they are habitually consumed. So dietary patterns are now at the top of the pyramid in the science of nutritional epidemiology. Formerly, we were interested in macronutrients. We were speaking about saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat. Then we moved to micronutrients. You remember beta-carotene, alpha-tocopherol, and all these stories. Then to foods, garlic, tomato, then food groups. So now we're interested in food patterns. Why? Because food patterns capture the overall exposure to diet. We can define in 4 ways the food patterns. The 2 first ways are selective diets. For example, the vegetarian diet. They select some foods. Indexes or scores. This is the Mediterranean diet. You apply a priori, before looking at the data, some criteria for classifying subjects according to their adherence to a specific dietary pattern. And then you can use 2 statistical approaches, cluster analysis or factor analysis, to be data-driven. So from the data, you see the patterns that you can find. And we relate these patterns to the occurrence, to the incidence of disease, to health outcomes. This is the way of the methodology. What are the advantages of dietary patterns? They capture interaction between nutrients. We do not eat nutrients in isolation. We always eat nutrients in combination, and they interact. If you look at only one food, you cannot capture the interaction, the antagonisms. We preempt confounding by other dietary confounders. So this is a good advantage. We increase the statistical power because it is unrealistic to assume that a single nutrient is going to have a strong effect on disease. But many changes, small changes in a lot of nutrients will have. So the cumulative exposure increments the effect, avoids the problem of multicollinearity in regression models, and avoids issues of multiple comparison. And from a public health point of view, the assessment of dietary patterns is an interesting reality in itself, because we can capture what are the exposure more prevalent in the population. So from a descriptive point of view, this is also interesting. There are also limitations. We don't know what of the 2 approaches is better, the hypothesis-oriented, selective dietary patterns, or a priori defined versus data-driven dietary patterns. We don't have many data about reproducibility, so sometimes we use the sample-specific medians of a specific cohort, for example, instead of setting normative cutoff points. And there is heterogeneity and measurement error in dietary assessment. And lifestyle, of course, differ between categories of dietary patterns. So these are limitations also. So the advisory board concluded that there are 3 beneficial dietary patterns, and among them you find the healthy Mediterranean style pattern. This has been included in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015 that appeared last January. So, but for me, there is remarkable consistency in the findings. This is the most important point. They found remarkable consistency in the finding. So where is this consistency? So this is a very important paper published in June 2003 by a group from Greece, from the University of Athens, and they define now in an operational way the Mediterranean diet. Now we have an operational definition of the Mediterranean diet. They assign 1 point to those subjects who were above the median for the monosaturated to saturated fat ratio, fruits, vegetables, cereals, legumes, and fish. 1 point if they were below the mean for meat products or dairy, and 1 point for moderate alcohol consumption. So this score went from 0 to 9. 9 is the maximum possible adherence to the Mediterranean diet, and 0. So, and now we have what is the effect for every 2 points in several large cohorts. And you see that there is a fairly consistent finding in several large cohorts with good control for confounding that the higher the adherence to the Mediterranean diet, the lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. This has been reproduced once and again. So this is for each 2 additional points in this 0 to 9 score. So the relative reduction in risk is 10% for every 2 points. This is observational epidemiology, but the best observational epidemiology that we have for nutritional factors. When we remove from this meta-analysis those studies that only assessed fatal events. These are cohorts that only have very good baseline information and no tracking of their participants. They trust just in a record of mortality. We removed 3 cohorts from here, and then the heterogeneity disappeared, and the risk reduction was 13% instead of 10% for every 2 additional points in adherence to the Mediterranean diet. So we have a good body of evidence suggesting from observational studies that the Mediterranean diet is able to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. But you may say, well, these are observational studies. Observational studies can prove only associations, not causality. Have you ever heard that? So, we have this hierarchy of evidence. So, immediately before the randomized controlled trials, we have the prospective cohort studies. What I have shown so far are prospective cohort studies. So we may feel the need to have randomized controlled trials with hard clinical endpoints. That is what we did in Predimed. But previously, we need to consider all these. These are the Bradford-Hill criteria for causality in observational epidemiology that were instrumental to demonstrate the causality of tobacco in lung cancer, tobacco in cardiovascular disease, and without any RCT, this was translated into policy changes, strong policy changes that have been absolutely key for public health, for improvement in public health. So all these criteria are met by the observational studies of the Mediterranean diet and cardiovascular disease. In fact, this is a very nice systematic review. This is not one systematic review. This paper included 32 systematic reviews of all the major nutritional factors in relation with CHD, and they ranked all the studies, all the meta-analysis according to causality, taking into account the Bradford-Hill criteria. Do you know what was the number 1 in the ranking? The Mediterranean diet. And this was according to observational epidemiology. But, so we were in a very good position now to do a trial. And we developed the Predimed trial because we have a lot of observational evidence to expect an inverse association, a protection by the Mediterranean diet, which is causal, against cardiovascular disease. And we developed this RCT, the effects of the Mediterranean type diet on the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, the Predimed study. This is a multi-center trial. This is the design. We included men and women from 55 to 80 who were at high risk of cardiovascular disease, either because they were type 2 diabetics or they have 3 or more major cardiovascular risk factors. And we randomized them to 3 groups, equally sized group. The first 2 groups received intensive education on how to follow the Mediterranean diet. In the first group, we gave them for free 1 liter a week of extra virgin olive oil for them and their families. In the second group, we provided for free 3 nuts, 30 grams per day, half of them as walnuts, the other half as almonds and hazelnuts. And in the third group, we gave them the step 1 diet of the American Heart Association recommending a low-fat diet. That was the state of the art at that time. We started this trial in 2003. This is a multi-center trial with 11 recruitment centers. These are the PI of all the centers in Spain, all around Spain. And we recruited 7,447 participants. As far as I know, this is the largest trial in Europe for nutritional factors. And these are the characteristics of our participants. As you see, the average age is 67, more than half of them women, half of them with diabetes, most of them with hypertension, dyslipidemia, or obesity, especially abdominal obesity. They were very well balanced because of the randomization and the large sample size, so they were essentially equal in everything else with the exception of the diet. So we can now infer causality because only the diet can explain the differences in rates of cardiovascular disease. And we did an intervention. This is the intervention with the Mediterranean diet. All items written in blue were encouraged, and all items written in red were disencouraged. So we did an intervention with an interview, personalized interview with a dietitian every 3 months during 5 years of follow-up intervention, and every 3 months the dietitian negotiated with the participants to increase the consumption of olive oil, vegetable, fruits, wine, legumes, fish and seafood, nuts, poultry instead of red meat, and sofrito. I will later explain what sofrito is. So, and they discourage the consumption of red meats, butter, margarine, cream, soda drinks, cakes, sweets. And they have also every 3 months a group session in the three separated arms of the trial with less than 20 participants to discuss in depth all these aspects. And we provided for them shopping lists, menus, recipes, explanation of the typical foods of the Mediterranean diet, lectures of cuisine, of Mediterranean cuisine for the participants. And we describe here in this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine what were the goals for the Mediterranean diet and for the control group. We have a similar 9-item score of adherence to the low-fat diet that they use every 3 months. This is a very interesting tool. We use this 14-item tool to assess compliance with the intervention, to do the assessment, and at the same time to do the intervention. Because this, can you see these questions? These questions only take 2 minutes to be completed. And in 2 minutes, you have sufficient information as to provide immediate feedback to the participant. So for you, for example, for cardiologists, never forget that you are always in the golden moment of a patient after an acute coronary syndrome. He or she will never be so highly motivated to change their habits unless you intervene in that moment when the patient is admitted, some days later perhaps, but you will miss this excellent opportunity. And this is easy to be translated into clinical practice. So we have validated this screener with, this is sofrito. You see here, this is a slowly simmer sauce made of tomato, garlic, onion, or leek, salted in extra virgin olive oil that you prepare as a dressing for pasta or fish or rice. And we recommended then to consume it at least twice a week. So we have validated this score against biomarkers of cardiovascular risk and risk factors. So these were our outcomes. The primary endpoint was a composite of MI, stroke, or cardiovascular death. And we found this strong reduction in risk in the 2 Mediterranean diets in comparison with the control group. A 30% reduction in the adjusted analysis, in the multivariable adjusted Cox model. This is the Kaplan-Meier. From the very beginning, we saw a departure. We saw very dramatic changes after 3 months, just after 3 months in cardiovascular risk factors. And we found a statistically significant result. We stopped the trial after a median follow-up of 4.8 years. The trial was planned for 6 years, but the Data and Safety Monitoring Board recommended us to stop the trial in the 4th interim analysis. So this has attracted a lot of attention. According to Almetric, we are now the number 1 out of almost more than 14,000 papers assessed from the New England Journal of Medicine. And we saw in each of the particular components of the composite endpoint, we found lower rates always in each of the 2 Mediterranean diet groups than in the control diet. Somebody may say, well, you found a strong effect for a stroke, but not for the other components of the endpoint. But we define in the protocol from the very beginning a composite primary endpoint, as it is customary in any cardiovascular trial. They share similar pathological mechanisms, and you need to define a composite endpoint because you need a statistical power. And methodologists, people working in methodology, they recommend that this is the most sensible option, to use a composite endpoint. So it is not legal, let's say that, to split the composite endpoint in several aspects. Okay? So we have published other outcomes. Peripheral artery disease, diabetes, atrial fibrillation, breast cancer, cognition, depression. And we are now working in these other outcomes that will appear soon published. So the strongest reduction in risk that we have observed is for peripheral artery disease. This was published in JAMA 2 years ago. So we found, especially for extra virgin olive oil, a significant in both reduction with respect to risk. This is symptomatic peripheral artery disease with amputations and bypasses and so on. And these are the Kaplan-Meier curves. And now we are in the 7th of April. You know, the WHO was founded exactly today, 70 years ago. It was founded the 7th of April of 46. So we have every year, in the 7th of April, is the World Health Day. And this year, it is the slogan is Beat Diabetes. So I take this opportunity to speak about what we found regarding diabetes. Formerly, they used to say that the diabetes, type 2 diabetes, was a cardiovascular equivalent. This is not so well founded nowadays. But, of course, it is a very strong cardiovascular risk factors. Half of our population were not diabetics when we included in the trial of the Predimed. So we were able to assess what was the effect of the Mediterranean diet in the prevention, in the primary prevention of diabetes, and we found a strong reduction of 40% relative reduction in the risk of developing diabetes, and a non-significant reduction with tree nuts on the Mediterranean diet. So these are the Kaplan-Meier curves. This was published in 2014 in Annals of Internal Medicine with 273 cases. So we have also this systematic review, very recent systematic review. So we have a tool for preventing type 2 diabetes. That is the Mediterranean diet. In one RCT, and 8 prospective cohorts. One of them was conducted in my center, the Seguimiento Universidad de Navarra, the SUN study. We found a strong protection against type 2 diabetes in an observational cohort. So this is clinically relevant for public health, and encouraging the Mediterranean-like dietary pattern may be a very sensible approach for prevention of type 2 diabetes. So atrial fibrillation, the main arrhythmia. Atrial fibrillation is related to inflammatory processes and oxidation processes in the remodeling of the atria. So we thought that extra virgin olive oil that contains a lot of polyphenols with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties perhaps may be able to reduce atrial fibrillation. And this is the first trial with a 5-year follow-up finding a reduction in the incidence of atrial fibrillation with a dietary pattern. We didn't find a significant effect for the other dietary pattern with nuts. These are the Kaplan-Meier curves, and we found after 2-3 years of follow-up, we found a significant reduction in the risk of atrial fibrillation with the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil. So what about cognition? There are several meta-analyses. You see the title of all these systematic reviews, all of them speaking about Mediterranean diet and cognitive function. There are apparently more meta-analyses than original studies. This is funny. But in this very recent meta-analysis that has not Mediterranean diet in the title, but in the conclusion, they found that for all the dietary exposures, the strongest effect is for the Mediterranean diet. But this is a meta-analysis of observational studies. You see the number of original studies and the number of meta-analyses? Funny. So we published last May the results of the Predimed trial in a subgroup with 343 Predimed participants after 4.1 years with a battery of neuropsychological tests to assess cognitive function in the three groups. And we found that for memory, we have a positive change. This is with baseline and after 4 years in the scores that was significant for Mediterranean diet plus nuts versus the control group. For frontal function, this was highly significant from extra virgin olive oil versus control, and for the global function for extra virgin olive oil versus control. You see that in control group, as is to be expected at this age, the cognitive function is declining with age, whereas here we see something very, very promising. We were able, with a dietary pattern, to improve. This is consistent with another study that we conducted in our center, in another subgroup, but only with final assessment of cognitive function. And we found something similar in 500 participants. So, why the Mediterranean diet is able to do all these wonderful things? You can see this is a very nice paper by a French group. They say that unless you follow the Mediterranean diet, it's very difficult that you may meet all the nutritional requirements for all the micronutrients. And we also assessed here in the SAN, Seguimiento Universidad de Navarra, in this cohort, what is the association between adherence to the Mediterranean diet and the likelihood of failing to meet nutritional requirements in all these nutrients. So this is an advantage of the Mediterranean diet. It covers all the nutritional requirements, and it is also palatable. It is also easy to follow. We have reproduced this also in the Predimed study. We found that the higher the adherence to the Mediterranean diet, the lower the likelihood to fail to meet the nutritional requirements in all these nutrients. And in addition, as you all know, atherosclerosis is an inflammatory disease. So the immune activation in the coronary artery initiates coronary syndromes. So there are several biomarkers of inflammation that we can measure in peripheral circulation, and we showed in the 3 first months of follow-up of our participants in Predimed very good changes in these biomarkers, CRP, interleukin-6, adhesion molecules, with the Mediterranean diet, especially when supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, which is rich in anti-inflammatory polyphenols. A lot of laboratory studies have shown. And this is a meta-analysis showing the effect of the Mediterranean diet on these biomarkers, CRP, interleukin-6, ICAN-1. So as you see, there is consistency in the findings that the Mediterranean diet is able to reduce inflammation, the low-grade state of inflammation that is related to coronary syndromes. And in fact, there is a new scoring system called the Dietary Inflammatory Index that was proposed 2 years ago by a group from South Carolina University, James Hebert and Nitin Shaibappa. And we have applied this in the Predimed, and we have seen that if you assess the potential for inflammation caused by the diet, you see this dose-response trend, that the higher the potential for inflammation caused by the diet, the higher the risk of major cardiovascular events. And we have replicated the findings also in the SAN observational cohort. So we have found that the inflammatory potential of the diet is definitely very important. And the Mediterranean diet, it has an inverse correlation, a strong inverse correlation with the dietary inflammatory potential of the diet. So it is anti-inflammatory. So this is Predimed. Now we go to the next stop. The next stop is Predimed Plus. So we want to go beyond. In Predimed, we went from the low-fat diet, that was the former recommendation of the American Heart Association. Things have changed. One step forward to the Mediterranean diet. Now we want to go beyond. We want to go to something that includes also energy restriction, so restriction in calories, physical activity, and a behavioral intervention with goals for weight loss. So In the Predimed 1 trial, we did nothing regarding physical activity, nothing regarding weight loss, and nothing regarding caloric restriction. Now we want to incorporate this into a new trial. In the new trial, our control group is the Mediterranean diet. It would not be ethical to put here the low-fat diet. We know now that the Mediterranean diet is better. So we are using the state-of-the-art here. The usual care is Mediterranean diet, and now we are applying this full package in this trial with 6,000 participants. These are the eligibility criteria from 55 to 75, a little bit later for women, with a BMI between 27 and 40, and with metabolic syndrome, and less than 25% of them diabetics. And we will provide for free, again, extra virgin olive oil and tree nuts, but to both groups. In this group, we will do nothing regarding physical activity, nothing for weight loss, nothing for caloric restriction. And this is called Predimed Plus trial. We go on. This is good news. After 13 years working together, in spite of the egos of the investigators, we remain good friends. So this is good news. All the previous centers are recruiting for the new trial, and we have incorporated 12 new centers. Now we have 23 centers recruiting all over the country. And we have this Data and Safety External Monitoring Board with Mary Stanford from Harvard School of Public Health as our chair, and John Sabater, Arnie Astru, Francisco Fernandez Avilés, who is the boss of the Spanish Society of Cardiology, and Xavier Pisunier from Columbia University, that was the chair in the Predimed 1, the DSMB. So our primary endpoint, this is not a trial for weight loss. This is a trial for cardiovascular prevention. So our primary endpoint is, again, the same, heart cardiovascular clinical events. And we are now collecting more and more data. We have, in Predimed 1, we have a blood collection every year. We have a repeated FFQ every year. We are now doing depression, cognitive function, and so on. And we collect urine samples and blood samples every year. We do genetic testing, so quality of life. And the plan for the trial is, again, 6 years. But we need to do a very intensive intervention now. In the Predimed 1, we did an intervention every 3 months. Now we are doing 3 interventions a month, 3 contacts with the participants a month. This is very, very demanding for our dietitians and nurses. We have in each of the 23 centers at least 1 dietitian and 1 nurse. In some of them we have 2. And they have 3 contacts, 1 group session, a personal interview, and a phone calling every month with the intensive intervention group. And we provide for free extra virgin olive oil and tree nuts. And starting in the 2nd year, we have only 2 contacts per month with the intensive intervention group. And we have expanded our screener, our brief tool for assessment and intervention. Because now it is an energy-restricted Mediterranean diet. So we recommend all the things in white font, and we restrict all the things in pink font. So we restrict red and processed meats, butter, margarine, cream, sugary beverages. You see, it is very similar to the 14-point score, but now we are putting stronger limits to the consumption of, for example, white bread, refined grains, rice or pasta. We recommend whole grains that we didn't do in the Predimed 1 trial. And we put limits to the consumption of wine that we didn't put in the Predimed 1. So, well, and what do we do in the control group? We do a minimal intervention by additions, only with 2 contacts per year. Total energy intake is ad libitum. We give all the written material to participants of the Predimed 1, exactly the same as the Predimed 1. No specific recommendation of physical activity, no self-monitoring, no weigh-ins for weight loss, and we provide for free the same amount of virgin olive oil and tree nuts. And these are the characteristics of the first 3,000 participants analyzed so far. So they are about 3,000. They are a little bit younger than in the Predimed one. We have now slightly more males than females. You see the baseline BMI is 33. Most of them with hypertension. We have more diabetes than we intended at the beginning. And they are of primary education, 50% of them. And we are recruiting them in primary healthcare centers. So this is how our recruitment is going. You see, our goal is to end the recruitment this year with 6,000 participants. Up to this moment, we have almost 4,000 participants recruited. So this is the first time that I'm going to present these results. Preliminary accomplishments up to this moment. So in blue font, you have changes after 6 months, and in black font after 1 year. The recruitment is ongoing. This is a working report. But you see that we achieved a 5% reduction in weight, significant versus control, and very impressive the change in the prevalence of obesity. At the beginning, 75%. Now in the intervention group, it is only 56%. And the good news is that as the trial is progressing, instead of seeing relapses, we see that the effect is growing. So this is good news because the Mediterranean diet has a strong potential for sustainability. And we have obtained these increases in physical activity in adherence to the 17-item energy-restricted Mediterranean diet. This is the chair fitness test. It's a very simple test. How many times can you stand up and sit down in 30 seconds? And we have seen this improvement, and the METs minutes per week, and reductions in energy, in total energy intake. So thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions.